Hello, economists. This is Jeff Beckstrom coming to you once again with one more AP Econ content and review video for Unit 5 Factor Markets. Today's topics are globalization, free trade, and protectionism in the form of tariffs. So let's get down to the slides. Hello, there it goes. The little spinning earth. All right. So when we're talking globalization, it's a pretty broad term that means a lot of things. Globalization can take place culturally, but for the purpose of this class, we're going to be talking about economic globalization. So what is economic globalization? It says here, lowering of international barriers to trade, allowing firms to manufacture and sell goods and services more easily across international borders. This happens all over the place. Smartphones are a good example of this in the modern economy, wherein the intellectual property behind smartphones are designed in the United States and in Korea, to name the countries of the top two smartphone producers, and then manufactured in many, many different places and assembled in many different places all across East Asia, Southeast Asia, and in North America. Economic globalization is happening because, well, for the most part, countries are getting on the same page with the idea of gains from trade. Gains from trade was a concept from Unit 1, if you remember, that countries specializing in some producing the thing that they have the lowest per unit opportunity cost in making, specializing in that and exporting it and importing other goods, which they would have a higher per unit opportunity cost to make, expands the consumption possibilities. So that idea of gains from trade brought all the way up here into Unit 5 to talk about gains from trade and globalization. And one other piece of vocabulary before we dive into the little bit of content we have after this is outsourcing. Outsourcing means hiring people from a foreign country to do work formerly done in that company's home country. There's oftentimes a negative connotation around this idea of outsourcing. For example, General Motors moving a car manufacturing plant from the Detroit area to Mexico would be considered outsourcing. People who formerly worked in those General Motors manufacturing plants in the Detroit area obviously have a dim view of this idea of outsourcing, though the costs of cars in the consumer market are kept competitive by firms being able to find lower cost labor. And the economic development of the country of Mexico is helped by more high-skilled jobs in their manufacturing sector. So this can sometimes be a kind of economic nationalism point to make, or economic populism, as you might be more familiar with that term. Anyhow, for a lot of years, low-skilled jobs were outsourced. If you've interfaced with a large company over the phone, you may have been connected to a call center where you couldn't quite place the person's accent who is answering the phone. And those are typically around the world in other countries, though high-tech kind of tools are allowing the outsourcing of many other types of labor that would otherwise have not been outsourced, like a virtual doctor's visit, for example, might be something that is outsourced to a foreign country in the future. So there's some advantages and disadvantages. Some of the disadvantages of globalization is that it creates unemployment locally. It's U.S. unemployment, so I'm in the United States. As jobs leave the United States, those people need jobs and they are in the labor pool, but they're unemployed. There's less tax revenue generated from workers and corporations, meaning less public benefit, less money for government to do public works projects. Foreign workers don't receive the same protection. So this is kind of a humanitarian point. Like I mentioned earlier, it's all well and good for consumers to have lower prices, but in the lower price I'm paying for my car or my cell phone or my cheap dollar store toy or something like that, are there the tiers of child labor embedded in those things? And a lot of the clothes we wear, there's some pretty good arguments to be made that that is true. But some advantages of globalization is that it lowers prices. We love to buy stuff, especially in the industrialized world, and lower prices are better for everyone. And we see a decrease in the unemployment in developing countries and more potential for worldwide economic development, which that third point is pretty much the exact same point. That says poverty under my face. Here, let me move my face. There we go. So the economic argument for globalization we can see through the analysis of tariffs. So we've already talked about gains from trade. That's one part of the economic argument for globalization. Now we're going to talk about tariffs. A tariff is an excise tax or a per unit, remember excise tax is a per unit tax, which is imposed on anything that's imported into a country. The purpose of a tariff is to protect domestic producers from competition from around the world. For example, there was a famous solar panel maker in the United States that received a huge government loan, a $500 billion loan to amp up $500 million loan to amp up their production in the United States, but they still weren't able to compete with solar panels that were manufactured in China price-wise. It turns out that the Chinese government had put a whole lot more stimulus into their own solar sector, but that's a question for another day. We want to also prevent domestic unemployment while still gaining some of the benefits of globalization in terms of cheaper prices. So this is an example of a tariff question that you might see on a AP exam from the College Board. The letters are corresponding to areas instead of points of intersection. P sub W is the world price. In this example, we see that an unlimited amount of grain, so we can see that this it's a market for grain, quantity tons of grain. An unlimited amount of grain is available from the world market at P sub W. Of course, the amount of grain in the world isn't unlimited, but for the purposes of analyzing this question for a single country, as the one that's depicted here with the domestic supply curve and domestic demand curve, the amount of grain available at the world price is unlimited. P sub T indicates the world price plus a tariff. The dollar amount of that tariff would be then P sub T minus P sub W. So you should pause the video now and see if you can work through these parts of this question. Find consumer surplus and producer surplus before any trade. If this example were opened up to world trade, see if you can find consumer surplus and producer surplus after world trade. You'll notice if you do this accurately that the area of total surplus is greatly expanded in questions 3 and 4. And then what if we traded at the tariff level? What would be the cost of trading at the tariff level? Take my face off of there for just a minute so you can read the rest of that question. So if the government sets a tariff equal to the tariff I discussed a moment ago, what happens to consumer and producer surplus? And I'll show you that area of deadweight loss next. So pause the video now and try to work through these questions. Now that you've restarted the video, let's go over the solutions. So here's my answer key. Consumer surplus with no trade is right there, and producer surplus with no trade is right there. This is very simple and obvious. That should hopefully be simple and obvious. Unit 2 concepts, producer and consumer surplus. Consumer surplus, if we trade it at the world price, is this area. And you can see that consumer surplus has grown greatly. Not only has it taken over areas I and L of what used to be producer surplus, but that has also captured areas J, K, M, N, R, and S. So a huge increase in surplus for consumers getting to buy cheaper grain at the world price, but producer surplus gets hammered down all the way only to area T. So you'll notice that the quantity Q3 minus Q1 is the amount that is no longer being produced domestically. So that represents a loss of jobs in the domestic grain market. So farmers being put out of business and so on and so forth. Under the tariff price, the amount that's imported is the difference between what's consumed or demanded at the world price and what's produced domestically at the world price. So you may see a question like this that asks you, how much is imported at the world price? And that would be Q5 minus Q1. So the difference between Q5 and Q1 is most of the grain in this country then gets imported. Moving on with the solutions. So at the, part 5, question number 5, that's the amount that we import right there. I forgot that I had that on the slide. And then if the government sets a tariff equal to P sub T minus P sub W, what happens to consumer and producer surplus? The blue area is the new area of consumer surplus. So consumers are better off with that world price plus a tariff, just so long as the price doesn't go up as far as it did originally at the no trade level. The red area of M, N, R, and S is deadweight loss, and the yellow area of T and L is remaining producer surplus. So Q2 minus Q1 is the amount of domestic production that is protected by this tariff, and that amount of domestic production being protected by the tariff equals jobs not lost. So politically speaking, tariffs can be very popular among people in certain industries. It's often why you hear politicians making these kinds of economic arguments about protecting industries by putting tariffs on certain goods to try to sway certain voters in certain districts of certain states in order to win, say, the electoral college majority, something like that. And now what I want you to do is do a similar question from a previous year's AP exam on your own. So here's that question. Sorry about the resolution on the question, but you can pause it here to work through this example. Now that you've worked through the example, let me take you through the solution. For part A, numbers 1 and 2, the price of oil in the United States is P2, and the quantity of oil produced in the United States would be Q2 under no trade or before the trade occurs. And the United States begins to import oil at P sub W. The quantity imported is going to be Q3 minus Q1, very similar to the question we just solved a moment ago together. So Q3 minus Q1 here. Identify consumer surplus in the United States before and after, and then producer surplus before and after. Remember, consumer surplus would be KGP2 and P2GP1 as the area of consumer surplus and producer surplus before trade, and then after trade, we see an area of consumer surplus of KHPW and an area of producer surplus of PWJP1. As you can see, the answers here. That's all that I have for you on today's review of globalization, free trade, and tariffs. Please make sure you're ready for a tariff question on this year's AP Microecon test by working through the examples in this screencast. Thanks very much. Have a good one.